I'm Lawrence Francis, host of Interpreting Wine, the place to learn from thought leaders in the world of wine and marketing, welcoming you to the Washington State Wine This Is Now series. Across these 2 episodes, I'll be exploring Washington State, first from a strategic perspective, before covering one of their major international events, the Washington State Grand Tasting, which will take place in London, England on Monday the 9th of May. A specially commissioned series to complement the Washington State Wine Deep Dive I published on the podcast back in February 2021. We kick the series off today with my conversation with Steve Warner, President of the Washington State Wine Commission. We hear Steve's origin story and transition into leading the commission before he gives us an overview of the changes that have occurred during his tenure. He talks inward investment into Washington State, price-quality ratio of the wines, talks research investment and its outcomes, reflects on the impact of COVID on the industry, before giving us a virtual AVA tour of the state, talks Woodinville and its role in attracting younger consumers to Washington wine, before closing on the Sustainable WA certification and taking the message of This Is Now to the world. Enjoy.
I grew up in eastern Washington in a small town called Cle Elum. It's in some ways pretty famous in the Pacific Northwest in the U.S. because it was the site of a sitcom called Northern Exposure. And anyways, I didn't realize it then, but I was growing up and living in what would become the future of Washington wine and grape growing in Washington. I left when I was 17, went in the military, served in the military quite a long time, up to 23 years. In 2 branches, Air Force and the Navy. And that led me to living overseas, working overseas in markets like Thailand. Then I lived in Korea for a while, and then finally Bucharest, Romania, as the head of a pharmaceutical company. So I had this broad international experience. I had marketing experience, sales experience, running organizations. And it just so happened one day, I got a call from a very close relative, said she wasn't well and needed my help. And so I reached out to a local recruiter and said, do you have anything? And they said, we have a perfect job for you. They said, it's the head of the Washington State Wine Commission. I said, well, I don't know anything about wine. He said, well, it's lucky for you that they're not looking for a wine expert. They're looking for other skill sets, like international marketing, like general management. They really wanted to bring someone from the outside of the industry inside and look at it differently and approach it with more of a, for lack of a better description, more of a kind of professional corporate, strategic planning and team development sort of aspect. Yeah, this was 2012. So I've actually been in my role now for 10 years. And it was funny because when I first took it, they were asking me to commit to 3 years. And, because the concern was that it would be 3 years and I would be gone, going from the GM role and with 350 employees to a team of 10. But I really enjoyed the job, and I enjoyed working with the industry to build the strategy, to build the team. And it's been 10 years of mostly highs and very few lows.
Super interesting to know that you were actually born right there in the region. So I'm really interested to, hear your own, I guess, description and kind of interpretation of what's going on over there. And I'm also really fascinated to hear more about the work of the Washington State Wine Commission. So I think the best place to start would be to kind of ask you to take that sort of drone's eye view, really, I guess, of the commission and maybe, pick up the story in terms of, what might be some of the changes that you've overseen during your time, and kind of, bring us up to date with where we are as what is the current state of the commission.
Yeah, Lawrence, it's interesting. And I think the founders were pretty smart in setting up what is titled the Washington State Wine Commission. And it really is an organization that's underneath the state of Washington Department of Agriculture. So we are a state government body, but we're funded through assessments. So every winery pays 14 cents per case of wine, and every grower pays $12 per ton on fruit during crush. And that is essentially what funds our activities. And our activities are actually very straightforward. It's basically to raise awareness and demand of Washington state wine, and to drive research of viticulture and enology forward. And just breaking down the marketing piece, as you know, the wine world is very, very, very competitive. Wineries we don't want wineries to have to be in a position where they have to tell the Washington story. We want them to be in a position to where we're doing the work and creating the opportunity through events, through programming, through marketing, advertising, telling the Washington story, so that when they're in front of somebody and they've only got 30 seconds, they can tell their story about their brand. And hopefully the two come together. I'll give you some examples later on in the conversation about, matchmaking style events that we do, how we work with different PR to spread the word, advertisement investments that we make. But the purpose above it all else is to raise awareness of the brand Washington wine. Many people don't realize, particularly if they're new to wine, that Washington state is the second largest producer of wine in the United States. And as a matter of fact, when people used to think of Washington, or even still do think of Washington state, they think of Washington apples, right? We're known for our apples. We're also known for hops. We grow 80% of the hops, 75% of the apples. If you eat a potato anywhere in the world outside of the U.S., it's probably come from Washington. French fries, why, in like a McDonald's. Wine is the growth of wine has been relatively recent phenomenon. In 1983, we only had roughly 40 wineries, right? So that was the year our first AVA was established. You fast forward to today, and we have over 1,060 wineries. Those 1,060s produce wines that are available in all 50 states and in 100 countries around the world. I feel like we've just begun to scratch the surface of our potential and our growth opportunity. And we just have to keep the number of mid-sized wineries getting out there in the markets, right? Getting out there and helping raise brand awareness, I think, is the key to the next big step.
Something that really stood out to me as I re-listened to the Washington State Wine Commission series that I recorded back in 2021 was actually, I remember Kerry Shields talking about, she as a fairly small producer, as maybe that sort of mid-sized producer that you're talking about there, really kind of growing up and having contact with some of the pioneers, really, of the Washington State evolution, I guess you would say, in terms of its transformation. And I think that's maybe, yes, something that is part of the story as well. No, just in terms of how young the actual region itself is.
I think that's one thing that I really, when I get a chance to sit down and really break it down to people, our growth, we're so new in the world of wine. If you kind of look at the global wine clock, so to speak, we're so new. We're essentially would be newborn babies in the world of wine. If you look at other wine regions that have been producing wine for hundreds, if not thousands of years, you talk about the Antinores, I believe, are in their 22nd generation. In Washington, we're maybe moving from our first to second generation in some cases. Woodward Canyon, the small family, would be a good example out in Walla Walla, where they're moving on from first to second generation. But for the most part, we're still in that first generation. And I also like to put it in perspective by, if you get a bunch of winemakers in Washington sit around and they're having a beer and they're talking about harvest or crush, and they go around the room and they're talking about, oh yeah, this will be my 6th vintage, and oh, this will be my 10th vintage, and they go, oh my God, this is your 10th vintage? And if you put it into perspective, that means that he's had 10 tries to make wine.
Yeah.
And to make it even more amazing, that within those 10 times, they're scoring 95, 96 points on their wines. So I think the take-home message there is the pioneers kind of set the bar high. Then there's this huge sense of community collaboration, helping each other out. They want to see the whole industry succeed. And so when you're starting off as a new winemaker, you're already starting off from a pretty high base of institutional knowledge, for a lack of better term. And and then you sit around the tables and you discuss what's working and what's not working, and you share your information. And as a result, we're seeing more and more interest in winemakers coming in, not only from within the state and growing up from within the state, but also from outside the state, from California, from Oregon, from even international. And that's what makes it such an exciting wine region. It's youth, it's vigor, it's the innovation. We live coming from the Pacific Northwest and one of the most innovative areas of the world, and we're trying to keep that vibe or that feeling, that energy going, to keep up with the likes of, an Amazon or a Microsoft or a Boeing or somewhere along those lines.
I know that during our pre-call, you were keen to talk about the inward investment into Washington State from other parts of the US and indeed from internationally. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind taking us through some of those examples and giving us a bit of a case study as to why some of those outside companies have chosen to invest in Washington at this particular time.
Well, there's been several examples. I'll rattle off a few and dive a little deeper into one. But I think it all started with Gallo investing up here. Eventually, following behind them was Duckhorn. They came up and they're investing quite heavily and doing well. Cake Bread is another notable Napa. They have labels up here. We just had KJ, Kendall Jackson, announce an investment not even a few weeks ago, and even international investment from the likes of Valdemar out, building a facility out in Walla Walla and really want to establish themselves. But the one that I think is a great case study in particular would, in my mind, would be Duckhorn with their Canvas Back label. They wanted a premium Washington wine brand, and they saw what was going on in Washington with the scores. They saw the quality of the fruit that was being grown there, and they saw a lot of potential. So they developed a brand called Canvasback to start, and they really started investing in the fruit, in the development of the brand, and eventually into production facility and tasting room in Walla Walla. But the great story about that was you would think that Washington, maybe some Washington farmers would be like, no, stay away. We don't want you here. But they were very welcoming. And I think they were welcoming for two reasons. I think one, that's just the way they're wired. But two, they understand that having a premium Washington wine in Duckhorn's distribution and also associated with a global brand like Duckhorn was good for the state. It was good for Red Mountain. It was good all the way around. And if I can just back up a minute, I think that the reason we're seeing these investments, because I'm reading your mind, Lawrence, I'm reading your mind. I think it's multi-factor, but I think it's we weren't a one-hit wonder. We had numerous years, going on decades of having really high scores and really high quality and year-on-year consistency. And so it wasn't a so-called one-hit wonder out of this cute little wine region. People saw that we could really produce world-class wines. You look at some of the highest scoring wines ever, they have come out of Washington State. And so I think that kind of piqued people's interest. And then when you look at the cost of land compared to other areas, like even if you could find an acre of land in Napa, you're going to pay $300,000 to $1 million per acre, whereas in Washington State you can get an acre of land for $30,000. And then there's the availability of water. We have tremendous aquifers, we have irrigation systems, we have the fourth largest river in the United States with tributaries about the size of France. We have tremendous snowpack up in our mountains that help fill our reservoirs. So having that availability of water and having the availability of land also. We are currently about 60,000 acres. We believe that we could grow up to about 200,000 acres. And then the final point, which we can dive a little deeper on, is I do think that there's a concern about global warming and, how that's going to affect sites that are much further south in the U.S. We are pretty far north compared to some growing regions of California, for example.
Yeah. So there's every reason to come, and very very few not to come by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm really loving your take really on the scene there, Steve, because this isn't, as you say, this isn't necessarily the type of conversation that I would prioritize having with a winemaker. I think, actually talking about those, what are quite hard economic factors.
Yeah.
They're not romantic, but they are super important. They make a business viable. They give people jobs. They actually allow, as you say as well, that level of quality wine to be put out there at an accessible price point, which I actually think is hugely relevant, especially given, what's going on all around the world. And I think, that was something that really stood out for me looking down the sort of, I guess, price quality ratio, which I think, more and more people are going to be mindful of. And, it will give them that route into trying the wines, which, maybe priced very differently or priced much higher in comparative regions.
Almost certainly. I mean, it's. I think it all. If you dump it all into, a processing machine, dump in all the variables, it does show Washington does rise to the top as far as viable places to produce world-class wines at a reasonable price. We, if I go even a little more strategic, in the sense that the government of Washington, the state of Washington is starting to recognize that more. And part of that is because of the us telling them by doing these economic impact study reports showing that wine is the number one agricultural product in the state of Washington now. And that the sales of wine are comparable to apples, which we're known as the apple state. But when you talk about things like you said, like employment, we're employing 40,000 people in our wine industry. You look at growth potential, you look at tax collection, which they love, their tax collection. It's a very attractive agricultural industry, and we have very skilled farmers already. And, those investments that we're making, talking about strategic, and, we talked about people that were looking from the outside in and seeing an opportunity. The other big piece of the pie is that when people are growing up here and going through the programs, the various programs throughout the state, whether it be a 2-year program or a 4-year program, we want to make sure that we are in the best position to keep them in the state, to keep that knowledge. So, for example, we spend about 25% of our budget every year on viticulture and enology research with the simple mission of growing better grapes, making better wine. And we really do have a world-class program where all the priorities, research priorities, are set by the industry, and the funds are allocated or prioritized by the industry. So it doesn't matter. Well, and finally, the research is available to everybody, regardless of size. So the research is going to the right people at the right time, and it benefits everybody. So I think that also helps us attract talent and retain talent, which will also help us strategically in the long term continue to build, even higher.
Yeah, no, spot on. I was actually just looking at page 5 of the Washington State Wine Commission 101, in which you set exactly that out there, the priorities and that investment. I mean, I've not come across such a massive investment in research, and I think ultimately when those investments are made, there are huge economic benefits that flow from those, and I think that's maybe, yes, I'm excited that you brought that up, because I think that's maybe it's not always appreciated as being the work of a commission to actually think so long term, and the whole sort of driving the demand piece. But it might be interesting to just explore a little bit more about the research, which I know we did cover with Juan Muñoz Oca when we spoke about deficit irrigation. But yeah, maybe through that lens or through another, give a sense of what is actually coming out from that program and that significant investment.
Well, Lawrence, I'll back it up a little bit even further. If you go back to my introduction, I made a small mention that I worked in pharmaceutical industry and I actually started off as a research scientist in the pharmaceutical industry. And when I arrived and I started, talking to the farmers and the producers and the board members and just everybody, we didn't have a strategic research program. We didn't have a research program. We put together first the desire, and we built the support to actually build an independent research strategic plan. And the results of that plan was that we needed a dedicated plan, not only for all the things I said before about attracting and retaining, about doing relevant research in Washington rather than borrow, from another region that may or may not apply. It's very regional specific. All those reasons were there, but even more strategically, like thinking 20, 50 years out, we want to make sure that our wineries are not just selling a case of wine today, but they're in business 10, 20 years from now. And from a research lens, what could we do to ensure that happened? And that's why I love the way that we went through the process. It became one of our 4 strategic pillars in our overall strategic plan, so that elevated the importance. It wasn't just something we did as an afterthought. It was one of our 4 strategic pillars. The way that we structured it and hired a full-time person to drive the strategy forward, I think worked well. And what you see now is the formation of what we call the Wine Research Advisory Committee, which is made up of farmers and producers. And they're the ones that are really driving, working with the industry to drive the priorities. Is it water deficit research, saving, looking at different root zone deficit irrigation strategies, so that by variety, so that we know exactly how we dial in the water and save the money and be able to have it third party reviewed, really high scientific studies that are applicable to all of our farmers across the state, and then apply a financial number to it, like $600 million of savings, water. We can do that. We can look at different threats before they become too dangerous, such as different virus threats. We can look at technology. How are there better ways that we can use technology, because there'll be more pressure on labor as our industry grows, to do things like we reviewed a program during a recent call where there was a robot going down between the aisles. Right? Imagine like a little RC car, a 4-wheel drive, cameras mounted on the top, and a drone above the canopy. And they were in tandem, and they were identifying areas where they were releasing beneficial insects. Like really cool stuff like that, like areas, or mapping through different lenses of drones, so they can see areas where maybe a coyote chewed through a drip irrigation line and they've got too much water going on. In a plant. I mean, just really fantastic, innovative ways of approaching viticulture and enology. And I just, I have to tell you, if there's one thing that I feel really proud about being part of being here when it was built, let's say when I'm 20 years down the road and I'm sitting in my rocking chair, hopefully, thinking back, that would be definitely one of the areas that I'd be really proud of that we were able to add, because I think it's a strategic imperative, and it will help on so many different levels.
It's really, really fascinating to hear these conversations, and it's actually taken me back to some of the conversations I had with your neighbors to the south there in Oregon when I was over in the Willamette Valley, and I love wine from all over the world. I'm lucky enough to live in London, so I can get wine from all over the world. But I think, one of the things that you've just said there, it does remind me that, at the same time, kind of maybe, blending a few things together, we don't, or the winemakers more specifically, they don't get so many opportunities to make wine. So, almost every day counts really, every little problem, every coyote chew, or every intervention essentially that takes place in the vineyard or in the cellar, it has to be learned from, really, doesn't it? Because otherwise it's a kind of a wasted opportunity. And I just think that for me, those examples that you've given there, they are the best examples of the use of technology. I know that, the romantics, they like to, kind of eschew all types of technology, but I think, used with the right intention, the right intention is to think about the impact on the land, and to make better wine, and to actually give people I think a more sustainable, on the economic side as well. As you say, who knows what the future holds in so many different things. So it's sensible to be ready for those things, surely.
Yeah. And it's exciting. It used to be such a small program, and now that we're allocating 25% of our budget to it, we can not only address current issues, we can look at things that we think are coming down the road. Like maybe we see that there's some pest pressure or disease pressure from Oregon that we can anticipate maybe it'll work its way north, or even let's be fair to Oregon, could also come from BC, right? Because diseases and pests, they don't respect borders, even international borders. So we've got this one pot of money where we look at things that are like really in front of us, one that we anticipate could become in the near term, and then areas where we can be innovative and think outside the box, and even work with organizations and universities who know nothing about viticulture and enology, but they're really good engineers. And you say to them, hey, this is our objective. Mm-hmm. We want to know X, Y, and Z. You don't need to worry about how, you don't need to know anything about growing grapes. Just look at it from a problem-solving perspective, and how might you apply technology to that? And so that is exciting to me, that we are in a position where we can do all three right now.
Shifting gears, very keen to raise the topic of COVID with you, Steve, and really to, I think, raise it in quite a broad way, because there's obviously been lots happening and lots of impacts from COVID. But what I've seen, in my interaction with the wider wine world, I've seen lots of adaptations, I've seen lots of innovations, and even in some cases, some positives that have come out from that. And I just wonder, given that as a backdrop, what are your responses to that period?
COVID, that was challenging times for sure. It still, in many ways, is. But I'm kind of an optimist by nature and by heart, and I think there are some things that occurred that will forever change the way we do business in the wine world going forward. And some things that happened during COVID that will stick around for a while. And I'll get to a couple of examples. I mean, first, I want to start with the farmers. The farmers, essential workers. And so we had to do everything we could to make sure that they had proper support, PPE, medical treatment, all that. And I think a lot of people lose sight of that when they're locked in their house or their apartment, that the growers, the farmers, are essential workers, and they still have to go out in the fields, and we have to make sure that they're safe when they're out in the fields. And if you get COVID going through your harvest team, that would be awful. And so you have to also think about things about who you allow on your property, or when people are coming to drop off drop bins, how do you handle that? And so there was a lot of emphasis put on the health and safety of the farm workers. And thankfully we got through a couple of harvests without incident or serious incident. Fast forward to the wine side, the producer side. At first, we experienced pretty amazing levels of pantry loading. And I think you've probably experienced that as well. People rushing out and just just buy as much as you can, how long this lockdown's. And so the numbers literally went off the charts. We experienced that as well. The upside is that we experienced that. The downside is that most of that off the sales chart occurred in the grocery store chain, or the bigger chain levels, right? So the higher volume, lower price brands did quite well, and that propelled the industry up. The challenge was that in the U.S. in particular, we basically have 4 channels where wineries can sell their wines. They can do what we call the off-premise, which is the grocery stores, the wine shops, all that. They can do on-premise, which are restaurants, and then they can do basically their tasting room sellers. So their sales in their tasting room, wine clubs, and then possibly in that same area, but not completely directly related, is the shipping and the DTC stuff, right? So right off the bat, smaller wineries that weren't in that big, the higher volume, lower price grocery store chains lost 2 major paths to selling their wine. They were no longer able to open their tasting rooms, which was a huge thing. And then smaller wineries tend to have more placements on restaurant lists. They weren't able to sell their wine in restaurants because restaurants were closed. So a huge immediate impact. You can imagine what they were going through. Let's say that your marketing mix is I want to sell out of my tasting room 70% and 30% restaurant. Yeah. Overnight, your sales channels just completely were obliterated. Now, this is where I kind of roll into here is how they handled it and some things that may stick around that will benefit the industry going forward is thankfully we had a local legislature and a very active, what we call the Washington Wine Institute, which is the lobbying arm of the wine industry here, led by Josh McDonald, their executive director. He was in there working with the legislature, well, not in there, in Zoom working with the legislator, saying, listen, we're going to lose our wineries are going to go out of business unless we make some adjustments here to the laws that are governed by managed by the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. We call them the Liquor Board because they're strict enforcers of existing laws. So they changed some laws and some things such as curbside pickup was not previously an option. So now consumers could come by and pick up wine curbside from the winery. They couldn't go in the tasting room, but they could order it and then people could bring it out. They also passed some regulations that allowed wineries to deliver the wine directly to their customers, which was another great option for them. And then they've also done some other changes since then, allowing them to open more tasting room, those sorts of things. But those 2 key things allowed them to at least stay in business. And then what we did is we did a marketing campaign to encourage people in the state to support them. And we called it Drink for WA. WA is the short for Washington state abbreviation. And it really was all about setting up promotions, advertising, activations to remind local consumers that these local wineries were hurting and that they should order from them direct. Or when restaurants were allowing for takeout, we would match up wineries with restaurants and they would do takeout packages. And so we had date nights and, just kind of fun activations. Yeah. The whole message was, hey, listen, these guys are going to go out of business unless you support them. And I think obviously the best margin you can make working in a winery is if you can hand sell it yourself, right? So they're selling in the best margin and they're getting support of the marketing agency, the statewide marketing agency. They're getting support from wineries. Now if we can just get that motivation of locals to make that effort to when they could just order something online and have it delivered through something that they make the effort, and it caused wine club numbers to go up. It caused DTC numbers to go up. And so those are examples that really helped the smaller wineries survive and actually in a weird way thrive as we come out of COVID.
Following again, some of the Washington wineries, some of your neighbors in California and in Oregon, curbside pickup was definitely the term, wasn't it? And seeing what I've seen and what I've known over here in Europe, it's kind of astounding that it wasn't permitted before, and that it actually took that kind of once in a multi-generational event. Please, to actually move the dial on that and to kind of move it forward. And, it sounds as though everybody was was really pulling in the same direction. If we sort of thankfully with a little bit of distance between ourselves and that horrific time, it feels as though there were successes and it was everybody pulling together in the same direction.
It proved a couple of things. To me, it demonstrated that the legislature, as they were changing the laws, realized the importance of the wine industry in 2022. Whereas if this would have happened in 1983, I mean, who knows what they would have done? They would go, "What? We have a wine industry?" But it was big enough and it impacted enough people that they're like, "Okay, this is important." Not to mention we're paying $300 million a year in taxes, but that they probably wanted that tax revenue too. Who knows? And it also changed, to your point, the liquor boards are usually enforcement organizations that are trying to prevent people from over-consuming or even consuming. And so any roadblock that they can generate is something usually that they feel pretty strongly about. But they understood the situation. They're willing to make that exception. And the third point I'll make was that they made the exception and it didn't blow up in their face. Like there was nothing that happened that they went back and said, we shouldn't have changed that rule. No, we're adults. We want to support local. We swung by a winery. They brought out very safely a case of wine and put it in my trunk, and I drove away, and I didn't stop on the side of the road and start drinking it all, and then keep driving. No, I mean, we're adults. So I think that's one of those examples that I think will stick around, and that also I think it felt good for the consumer to know that they were supporting a local family owned winery.
Super interesting to reflect on COVID and the adaptations, but I'm also keen to knowing now that you're a Washington guy and this is a territory that you know well and you kind of grew up in. Really, just to zoom out a little bit in terms of the 19 AVAs and the really unique growing conditions that there is on the eastern side of the state, and I'll just ask it in a fairly broad way, really. Yeah, just to, in a sense, give us that again fairly high level view, a sense of that tapestry of different growing sites and different microclimates really that you've got there, which again is sitting behind this renaissance and this quality that we will then see in the bottle.
Yeah, Lawrence, I mean, I can't believe we're up to 19 AVAs already, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, if you look at the state of Washington and you look specifically at the Columbia Valley AVA, north, south, east, west, it is a ginormous AVA. It covers a lot of territory, something 4.6 million hectares. But it's just so diverse, that entire Columbia Valley. So I think what you're seeing now, and this is also goes back to us being a relatively young wine growing region, is that we don't even know yet where our best sites are. We don't even know yet where our best variety to site locations are. And I think that's what you're starting to see with these new AVAs, because, that takes a lot of effort to get an AVA approved, and you do have to differentiate yourself. So if we were to start really, wide with the Columbia Valley, you could easily fit, another 20 or 30 AVAs within there, if they're able to demonstrate the uniqueness. But I mean, just looking historically, it really was the Yakima Valley. And if you've ever been to Washington, that's that main area you go down where everything's grown: cherries, apples, hops, wine grapes. The south-facing slopes make it really, really great place. It was established in 1983 when we only had 40 wineries. So that really was the real kickoff to the AVAs for the most part. When you kind of transition out of there and go, well, okay, where were some of the earlier wineries established? Like winery licenses 2, 3, 4. That actually, funny enough, or strangely enough, came out of Walla Walla, from mainly wineries like Leonetti and Woodward Canyon and LaCole that were out in there, literally writing their own AVA, driving around in a truck and writing their own AVA submission package to the TTB. And it was really those groundbreakers that set the tone, I say, overall for Washington State. So that AVA is extremely important. 1984, I wouldn't be surprised if you see some sub-AVAs come out of it, because there is such a change in precipitation from east to west or west to east as you get closer to the Blue Mountains. The people are dry farming up on the Blue Mountains, for example. And so I think you'll see more to come. Even though it's one of our older AVAs, I think it'll be around for a while. Puget Sound is one of our earlier ones. You don't see much coming out of there. It's less than about 1%. But for tourists, because it's beautiful to visit, and they have unique varieties like Sigarebe and Mueller-Thurgau, it's fun to go out there and explore the islands, but it really doesn't represent much volume, only about 1%. The other big one, which is not big at all, it's Red Mountain. It's not really even a mountain. It's not really even red. It's basically a brown hill. But now, all joking aside, it has been known to create some of our more powerful and with structure Cabernet Sauvignon, less than 5 inches of rain per year, very hot. I don't think we're going to see much more out of Red Mountain. It's pretty much planted out right now. So we may see a little bit of tiny growth there, but they're just dialing in, how do we continue to produce these world-class cabs? And I mentioned before, like Duckhorn. So this is where they get their canvasback cab from, which is pretty exciting. I think if you transition on to kind of some of the lesser known, maybe newer AVAs, the Columbia Gorge is doing fantastic stuff. And the Columbia Gorge it's our furthest, it's down in the southern part of the state and it's further west, so closer to Portland. And it's a cross-border AVA. But some of the wines that are coming out of there, because it's really much more cooler climate. So you are seeing some Pinot Noir, but Chardonnay and some Pinot Gris. But some of the Chardonnays that are coming out of there are just mind-blowing. They're just really amazing stuff. A lot of cool things going on there. Great lifestyle. People, winemakers have moved there from all over the state because it's just such a beautiful place to live, and they love the cool climate. Great growing. Talking about Horseheaven Hills, a very large AVA, mainly on the southern part of the state. It's right on the Columbia River. It's where a lot of our Cabernet and Merlot acreage comes out of. It's just massive area. We're talking 230,000 hectares, and lots and lots of room to grow. So it's beautiful conditions too, and with lots of access to land and water. It works pretty well. Wallach Slope is another one that is a little bit further north, again, alongside a river. We've been seeing lots of growth out of there, mostly cab. Rattlesnake Hills, relatively small. It's a sub-AVA of the Yakima Valley. I think that's another aspect that you'll notice when you look at the AVA map. So we have a lot of nested AVAs. So the Yakima Valley AVA is nested within the Columbia Valley AVA, and the Rattlesnake Hills AVA is nested within the Yakima Valley AVA. Again, that goes back to my earlier comment where as people start to dial in these microclimates and really start to identify, locations and variety matches that work really well, I think you'll see more and more examples of that. Lake Chelan, far, far, far north. I think you'll see probably not much more planting there, but it is a beautiful place to visit. And some of the wineries up there are making some pretty amazing wines. It's a tourist destination I used to go to as a family. Every year, every August, the whole family would just go to Lake Chelan. And now it is even better because you can find good wine there, where before, I think I was restricted in my early days to maybe some Blue Nun or maybe some Mad Dog. But yeah, those are pretty cool. Smaller Snipe Mountain is making great fruit, beautiful location. I don't see it really growing much more than it is. I mean, but if you see anything with Snipes Mountain on it, you should be pretty excited to give it a try. Naches High, very small. I believe we only have 45 acres, only 2 wineries. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen with Naches Heights. It does have some room to grow. I just haven't seen a lot of plantings up there recently. One that's pretty exciting is the Ancient Lakes of Columbia Valley, because they just make some amazing white wines. A lot of our Riesling comes out of that area. A lot of our Chardonnay. Definitely cooler climate, even and in those huge diurnal shifts. But we're far enough white that you can really lock in that acidity, and it's really dominated by white varieties. This one is interesting. Lewis and Clark Valley AVA is a cross-border AVA with Idaho. I think it's more, we have more on the Idaho side as far as plantings. We only have 9 acres on the Washington side. So I'm not quite sure where this AVA is going to go, to be honest, but it does have room to grow. And we like to play nice with our neighbors. And then diving in just briefly on the newer ones, Royal Slope. This is another perfect example of, a place where there were some existing vineyards already within the Columbia Valley AVA. They felt very strongly that they were kind of dialing in on that site-specific, variety-specific area, and they were able to differentiate it enough that they were able to get the designation of Royal Slope. I think if you find AVA bottles or AVA designated, give it a try. It'll be really good wine. Candy Mountain, our smallest AVA, I think. It really is right now just 110 acres, I believe. And it's right next to Red Mountain. Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of similar qualities to Red Mountain. And then the Burn of the Columbia Valley is kind of an interesting one. It's there's this when you look at the Columbia River on the southern part of Washington State, the further you go west to east, the less precipitation there is. So the theory there is that for every 10 miles or so that you drive from west to east, you lose an inch of rain. So the Burn is kind of right smack dab in the middle on the Columbia River. So it's going to have some really nice structured cabs coming out of it. Going to have some impact from the Columbia River, not too much rain. So I think it'll a little bit more than what you get on Red Mountain, but not much more, maybe 2 inches more per year. So some good things to come out of there. White Bluffs, another great example of one of those areas where they've already had world-class wines coming out of, but they were labeled Columbia Valley, and they really want to differentiate them. And I believe we're down to our last one, number 19, which was Goose Gap. The interesting thing about Goose Gap is how in Washington most of the hills are actually south or southwest slopes. And these are actually dominantly planted on north and northeast slopes. So they grow the fruit longer, much later ripening because they have less of that afternoon sun. But they're significant. I mean, they're 1,800 acres, so they're growing quite a bit of fruit coming out of Goose Gap. And so it'll be interesting to see how these wines develop over time. And that leaves us at 19 AVAs, plus we have 2 more that are under petition right now.
Thanks so much for taking us on that different kind of virtual tour. I think it was really interesting for me to hear you talking in a sense of the future potential growth as well of these AVAs. Are they planted out? Because if somebody is listening and is even thinking of buying down there or making wine down there, I think all of those things are of course hugely important to bear in mind. And again, with room to grow in terms of the number of AVAs, I think it just also then speaks to just the youth and that sense of research, experimentation, figuring it out really, and that's exciting. I think that's a sort of energy that will really attract people, as you've already said, from all over the state, from all over the states, and I'm sure internationally as well. your whistle stop tour there really has kind of made me think to Woodenville, which actually we didn't really discuss too much on the for the first series, which is my understanding is this is where a lot of production facilities are based, where a lot of the wine is actually made and produced, but also where a lot of it is drunk, given its proximity to Seattle. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind just, giving us an insight into the importance really of Woodinville as a, if you like, as a showroom, as a showcase of all those things that you've just spoken about there, where people can actually virtually tour around the very diverse state, but through the glass. And again, through that experience, they can reach from Seattle, whether they live there or whether they happen to be visiting Seattle.
Yeah, I mean, Woodinville, it'd be interesting to ponder someday where our industry would be had Woodinville never existed. That's it. Definitely important to not only the history but also the growth of the entire wine industry. And I think what makes Woodinville so unique is its proximity to downtown Seattle. So if you're in downtown Seattle, you can be in Woodinville in 35 minutes. Mm-hmm. So what we get is we get a lot of people who are maybe new to wine, curious about wine, maybe new to Washington wine. Maybe they grew up in California, and we get a lot of transplants in the greater Seattle area because we are so tech rich and tech heavy in Seattle. Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of people who they move here and they've only had one type of wine their whole life. And so being 35 minutes away and having 150 plus wineries and tasting rooms, it really does make it convenient to go up to Woodinville and check it out. And Woodinville is actually divided into different areas. They have a warehouse district, and then they have another area, schoolhouse district, and they just recently launched a new area, and then they'll have a new area. So there's a lot of growth and development going on in Woodinville as well, because it attracts so many tourists. I'll get to that a little bit later, but there's development going on in the lodging space and the hospitality space and the food space, all in support of the 150 plus wineries and tasting rooms of all shapes, sizes. I mean, you've got Saint Michel that had more than a million. I forget what the number is exactly. I should know, but it's like 1.6 million people visit Saint Michel every year. And they're based in Woodinville right there. And then you've got the brand new winery that opened last week also there. Mm-hmm. So there's an opportunity for consumers to go and experience Washington at a very convenient location. And then in that way, what I think you're leading to, Lawrence, is it's kind of a gateway drug. Because once you're there and you're like, oh, wow, this wine's pretty cool, and this winery's pretty cool, and that label's pretty cool, and I didn't know I liked that variety. It causes them to dig a little deeper, and then out comes the map and say, yeah, our vineyard's just right there, just outside the, Yakima Valley. And people start putting two and two together, and before you know it, they're flying out to Walla Walla, or they're driving over to Yakima Valley, and they're drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak.
So interesting, and talking about it as a gateway, as a way to bring people in, and really the reason that I brought up Woodinville was really my own experience of reading and watching actually a webinar produced by Silicon Valley Bank on the state of the U.S. wine industry 2022, and again to bring forward your own points there around how people responded during COVID. They really went into that into a lot of depth. And I think that, the big headlines, were all very positive for wine, in a sense of, if you like, the pie got bigger, the actual investment in wine. And as you say, people were kind of hoarding it, and, people were thirsty. But I think something that they brought out, which was so interesting for me, was the fact that, okay, you had, essentially the average bottle price really going up, and people, if you like, that catch-all term, they were drinking less, but they were drinking better. And one of the things which, may or may not be a canary in the coal mine, they were talking about actually the challenges of attracting younger drinkers, and the challenge of that on-ramping, if you like, and actually the fact that the wines at that lower value, at the lower price point, I think it was a sort of $11 to $15, their sales had actually gone down, and I think, of course, pick up on that point, and I guess that's obviously a huge strategic challenge as well. But presumably, having Woodenville there is actually super important to be able to actually show people and to kind of bring people into the fold who maybe historically haven't been attracted to wine.
Well, you bring up so much there, Lawrence. The historical perception of wine, being maybe a little stuffy, maybe only for like special occasions. To shake that image is often a challenge, particularly when there's so many options across the board. Ready to drink cocktails, for example, canned wines. In our state, we have cannabis. So cannabis is a real deal as far as like share of space or share of a party. So you're right, to reach out to and engage younger audiences and more diverse audiences, we really have to be more thoughtful in our marketing and our messaging. And it's not always just about the wine, it's about the wine experience. So locations like Woodinville, having a tasting room experience or a winery experience or even a farm experience in Eastern Washington, they're very, very important. It's almost like it's becoming less of a commodity and more of a experiential, and that you can't phone it in, so to speak. You can't just it's not good enough to make just good wine, right? Or it's not good enough to make good wine and have a cool label. You have to market it in a way that people can identify with and say, hey, I want to be part of this. I want to be part of this experience. I want to be on that team. And so I do think Woodinville is very important to that. We're seeing a Seattle urban winery scene pop up that, I've been there, I don't know, a couple of weeks in a row, and they're always packed. There's food trucks. It's much younger, more energetic audience. They're doing concerts. They're doing all kinds of things because I think they do realize there's a shifting demographic in the wine drinker. A lot of the older ones are going the opposite way, right? They're drinking less and spending less. But I do think that everyone is aware of it, and that's kind of the biggest challenge is everyone's aware of it. So not just Washington State, but every winery around the world, and every ready to drink cocktail, every beer company, every wine company, every cannabis company, they're all aware that that's that demographic that they have to get to, and that they have a lot of choices, right? And how do you make them choose yours? And then the last thing I'll say about that, you're absolutely right about, I just looked at some Nielsen data from just a week ago, and the sales of wine that were priced $15 and up are up 33% versus 2 years ago. And I'm talking about just Washington wine, right? But all prices, right, were down 4%. So what you're seeing is as the average bottle price of the wine goes up, the total sales growth for Washington wine has been going up. So you will see, I think, more investments and more movement to above 15, even higher than $12 per bottle was up 22% versus 2 years ago. So you are seeing that movement for sure. If I just add another kind of just wrap up bullet point on Woodinville as well, is that we have a huge cruise industry in Washington State that most of the time they fly into Seattle, stay a few days in Seattle, and then jump a cruise ship to Alaska, and then come back and maybe stay a day or two. We're starting to see more and more of that cruise traffic. And this is a global audience. They're from all over the world. We'll take time and go up to Woodinville, and that also helps us spread the awareness of Washington State wine, and they hopefully have a great experience when they're there. Shifting gears a little bit to the importance of our certified sustainable. So a little inside, baseball, so to speak, or inside knowledge to share with you, Lawrence, is we've always felt very strongly being in Washington about sustainability. We're predominantly farming culture in Eastern Washington. We get it. Also on the west side of the mountains in the greater Seattle area, we tend to be much more health conscious. And so sustainability isn't necessarily anything new to us. And as a matter of fact, in our messaging and even in our research results, you can see that we're doing research to use less pesticides or less fungicides or less water. We were already doing that, but we were already at an extremely low point of extremely low disease pressure, extremely low pest pressure. And we were lucky in a sense that we had these high temps, these low humidity, the high winds, the winters where we have the hard freezes, right, where the vines harden off, go to sleep. We had the saying that we were sustainable by nature, and that was all really driven by the terroir and just the climate we're in, and it's truth. It really is. And we have data to prove that we use less water, we lose less inputs, so to speak. But we also realize that the world is changing, that there's climate change effects, that we, on our research side, as I mentioned before, we're already addressing certain challenges, and that we're looking at challenges we see 3 to 5 years from now. So we already realize that the world's changing, and saying that we're already sustainable really wasn't good enough, both from a commitment to sustainability for long term and also, frankly, from a consumer perspective. Consumers want to see a certification that has some teeth to it, right? Not just some fancy labeling or anything like that. They want to know when they pick up a bottle of wine that there's a process and an oversight that allowed you to meet the requirements to put that label on your wine. And so that's the direction we went with our new program. It's a statewide program. It's called Sustainable WA. It's a certified program by a third-party organization, third-party auditor, come in and make sure that the winery, or in this case, we're starting the vineyards, that the vineyards meet all the requirements. Now, what makes this program somewhat unique, in addition to being certified and having teeth behind it, it also goes just beyond what one might think of being certified or being sustainable in the vineyard, of just, what do you put on your vines? How do you treat your vines? How much water do you use? Things along those lines. But it also goes into labor. How are you treating your farm workers? Are your farm workers, do they have access to education, to healthcare? Do they have? So we're thinking of this really holistically, the sustainable approach. And the certified piece is exciting because it's not some sort of self-analysis or anything along those lines. It's somebody's going to come out and they're going to make sure you're doing what you say you're doing. And that's what's going to allow you to use the certified WA on your label. And I just got back, tying it in, I just got back from visits in Sweden and Finland, where I met with their head monopoly buyers. And we talked about some of the shelf blades they had in their monopoly stores. And they said, listen, sustainability is so important to us that at some point we will stop accepting bottles that are over a certain weight, right? If your bottle weighs too much, we won't even consider you. And they're going that direction. So pretty soon it'll be not only bottles, it'll be packaging, it'll be a level of certification. And there's going to be a huge barrier to entry unless you take this serious. And we are taking sustainability serious.
Yeah, that's it. It's coming. So, be ahead of the curve. And it's fascinating to delve into that. And, genuinely, I could sort of talk to you all day about these things. There really does seem to be, I think a depth of thought really that's again, come out from those first conversations that I had. I mean, I remember the theme of site selection being absolutely critical, for a winemaker, and actually, kind of all tying it all back together. It's that, I think it's that sharing of information as well. It's thinking wider about the state and making sure that people can still be making wine there and living there in 5, 6, 7, 10 generations. It needs really joined up thinking, but it needs action, as you quite rightly say. So yeah, it's really fascinating to have the chance to hear directly from you, just what it takes really, I think, to really be sustainable. It's an easy word to say. It's a buzzword. It's everywhere. But actually, all of the things that we've spoken about, I think they actually do come together into sustainability, and that is ultimately what we and the winemakers and what the state wants, isn't it? Economical and environmental sustainability.
Right. I mean, the worst thing you can do is harm your land, and for a short-term gain. And we're just, this program, being that it's statewide, will ensure that hopefully we can get to a 24th generation, winemaker in Washington.
And really, my last question to you, as we sort of stand here in April 2022, and by the wonders of modern technology, I'm in London and you're in Mexico City at the moment. I wonder if that might be an interesting metaphor to kind of close on, really, and to in the short term, let me and let my listeners know, some of your and the Commission's sort of immediate travel plans, maybe focusing on sort of some of the major trade fairs and major events that you've got coming up, and I'm just curious, what are the messages, and of course feel free to draw on anything that you've already mentioned, but what are the messages that you're most excited really about getting out there and sharing in person now that we're able to travel internationally once again?
Yeah, well, this first part is going to be an offer and a statement, I guess both at the same time. Is, we always win. When I mean win, I mean it opens people's eyes and they're like, I thought I understood it, but I really didn't understand it. Is when we get people to come to Washington and walk the vineyards, meet the winemakers, even during harvest, to participate in harvest. But even if you just are there, that's our that's our best marketing tool ever, right? Is we get people to Washington. So with that, the question is, would you like to come to Washington, Lawrence? And if so, I'd be happy to host you when you come out. Wow.
Yeah. Completely taken aback, and I'll leave this in here. And yeah, no, I absolutely, yeah. It's somewhere that, as I've made, without ever visiting, I feel like I've made friends, and I've made a genuine connection with, just in this past year. So, it would be amazing and incredible. Yeah.
I put you on the spot. I apologize for that, but I figured
it'll be funny to
the people already in Washington. It's a shame that you haven't had the opportunity to come out there. Okay, so number one, if we can get people to Washington, that's our number one marketing objective, our tactic. Number two is obviously getting the wine in their mouths and introducing them to the winemakers. They'll often be standing next to the winemaker who's in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, because we have fun, right? We work hard, we have fun, we don't take ourselves too seriously. And that's just generally how a lot of the winemakers are. And so if we get an opportunity, so that leads me to what, your question about, well, where are we and what are we doing? Mm-hmm. I'm in Mexico City today. I will be doing, as soon as this call is over, I will be going down to a trade tasting, trade and media tasting, where we'll also have a seminar that will be led down there. We have wineries and importers there as well. And the whole point is to kind of create that matchmaking. So the wineries, the trade can come through, along with the importers. If they find wines they like, then they'll work together with the winery to import that wine. So it's really for us creating that opportunity. Next stop for me will be, because I handle both international and domestic, we will be hosting 100 guests from the Wine and Spirit Guild of America. And they're the independent liquor store owners across the state. So they own hundreds of liquor stores across the state. So in this case, we'll be hosting them in Seattle for their meeting and then taking them to Walla Walla in a bus for a tour, right? Daughter graduates the next day from college, and then the next day I'm on a flight to Copenhagen. Why Copenhagen? Believe it or not, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, when you look at our export sales outside of North America, so excluding Canada and Mexico, Scandinavians love our wine. It's by far and away our number one export market, with Sweden really taking the lead on that. So we'll be going there for trade and media events as well. This time, funny enough, working with California. So oftentimes on our export activities, we'll work with different states. Like I'm in Mexico City with Oregon today. 2 weeks I'll be in Copenhagen with California. Prior to the Copenhagen event, we'll have events in London. London, or the UK market, is very important to us, primarily on the media side. We just love doing media events there. And then we have Pro Wine, and then a four-stop tour in Canada. And then in July, we have some sommeliers from the UK on an inbound tour. And so there's just always something.
Yeah.
Something. So, and it goes back to number one, number two. If we can get people out to the state, that would be huge. If we can bring the state to them, that would be our second choice. Okay, and that I'm gonna put you on the spot now. that the second part of that question is it possible to pick a seam that you see running through all of those activities, and or even just messages and that you're kind of super just charged up and excited to tell to the people? I think the theme is, and it's along the lines of our current marketing campaign, which is This Is Now, is there's kind of a play on that was then, this is now, as in that was then is maybe we're not old world, maybe we're not established California. There's also a little bit of play on that was before COVID, and this is after COVID. So This Is Now is about bringing the energy back and either reintroducing Washington to people, and everything we talked about the quality of the wine, the price points of the wine, the varieties, the winemakers, everything. And then the other element is, you can work in this industry for the rest of your life and not know everything, right? Because there's always new winemakers, there's always new players, there's always new people move, people do different things. You have different vintages, and you have different global things that you're considering. And so, say COVID. So it's always changing. It's never. If anybody ever comes to me and works in the world of wine and say, I know everything about wine, I'm going to turn around and probably walk away, because it's impossible to know everything about the world of wine. So a lot of it is to just keep people who are excited about Washington, and for people who are new to it, introduce them to Washington, because we do make some really amazing wines.
A huge thank you to Steve Warner, President of the Washington State Wine Commission. Some really fascinating discussion points and a great way to kick off the series. Do be sure to visit Washington State Wine online at washingtonwine.org. I've also left below the direct link to the Washington State 101 presentation, which contains all the key facts about the region. And be sure to visit them on social media, where they're at WA_state_wine on Twitter and Instagram, and at Washington State Wine on Facebook. And of course, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.